I'm Samuel Reynolds, and I'm going to talk with you today about, is there anything essential and dignified about essential dignities in the 21st century? The deal with dignities, meaning what we're going to cover today, this lecture will give a clear philosophical reason why the essential dignities is important, or essential dignity is important in chart synthesis. Because one of the things I struggled with for years, and maybe you've gone through the same issue, is when you read, like when I read like The Only Way to Learn Astrology, and I read about, once I realized I had a Mars in Capricorn, that it was exalted, or I had a Saturn in Aries, that it was fall. I was like, well, what does that mean? I got excited and then I got deflated all at once. So I'm like, okay, so what are these things about? And so it's been a journey for almost about 20 years to figure out what's the philosophy, or can we construct a philosophy that gives us a better idea of what essential dignities can do, especially if you're a counseling astrologer. I will advance an innovative way to appreciate different levels of essential dignity at a nitty-gritty visceral level rather than by doctrine. So rather than just telling you, well, this is what it should be. Why? Because that's the way it is. I want to give you more of an understanding. It is my understanding, right? It is not something that's been cultivated so much by what has been philosophically developed from others, even medieval, because there's not a lot there, believe it or not. There's more a mathematical, geometrical way to understand it that is usually outlined, but not a philosophical one. To examine planetary placements in various states of essential dignity, including with actual charts. I do have some chart examples more toward the end, but I also have a lot of things that you can use in a counseling capacity. So we start with the story of the essential dignity because there is a story that's being told. In every chart, a planet can find it easy to express itself, or harder to express itself, or become or be complacent about expressing itself or not. This mostly depends on the sign in which the planet finds itself. The key thing to keep in mind is that planets can describe what's naturally present in relation to given circumstances, not whether an event or person is good or bad. This is not about judging people. If someone has like a moon in Scorpio, oh, you're like that. It's about understanding one component in one set of given circumstances that you may or may not know. For instance, to give the flower to a person who, when he or she is sick, usually is greeted by being a good thing. But if we're talking about giving someone a gun in a hospital, that wouldn't be welcomed. But if they're threatened by somebody, then it would be welcomed. So we can look at all these planets as gifts. And in the right circumstances, they can be very useful. In certain other circumstances, whether we're talking about daily life, like that moon in Scorpio, you have to have a more creative way of engaging that planet. It's dealing with these different planets as gifts by the nature of their dignity, by the nature of themselves, so that we can find the right circumstances for them. Here's the table of essential dignities. Now, I have to give you a couple qualifiers because there are some adjustments to this table. So, first, I want you to note, everyone sees the signs, and these are the traditional planets associated with them by rulership, in terms of the column. And then we have the exaltations. For the purposes of this lecture, you don't need to focus on the particular degrees. And this is what's symbolized here, like 1503. These are the degrees of exaltation. Triplicity, which I hope we get to. Now I have to tell you, my main focus is going to be rulership, exaltation, and then their opposites, which are detriment and fall. But I hope to get to triplicity. Now the one distinction that I want to point out is that I use the Dorothean triplicity. And so Dorothean, as versus the Ptolemaic triplicity, has for all the water signs, for Ptolemaic, it's going to have Mars ruling both. But for what I use, I have Venus ruling during the day and Mars at night. I just want to tell you because you might see a different chart. That doesn't on Sam's chart, but the Sam down. So it's just a different qualification. And then I also use what's called the Egyptian terms or bounds. And face is just a fancy word for decans. Yes, I do cover that in triplicity, if I get to it, hopefully. This is time frame, but they're not on this table of dignities. The last thing I want to point out, which is very important for what I'm going to show you in just a little bit, is that they also have weighted value. So at the bottom, rulership has +5. Can everyone see the bottom? And then what's here for exaltation?
4, 3, 2, 1.
That's all. Okay, here we go. You got the idea. Again, that becomes important in understanding how I'm going to reframe what essential dignity is about. So the story of essential dignity starts with what I've come up with as 3 components. There's essence, which is primary, and I define essence as that quality or thing that naturally promotes its distinctiveness from all other things around it. So in some way, it is not like another thing. It is its own self or separate from another thing. Me from you, your essence. From the realm of the Platonic ideals all the way to the terrestrial realm, let me explain that. The idea to cut, let's say. Now that's just an expansive, broad idea. But we go down, we can say with more precision, to cut could be related to an idea of a blade. You know, to actually cut something. Then we can all go down to more even, I guess even a little more concrete, to talking about, like, say, scissors. So there's a way in which we can look at a particular kind of quality, or even a thing, in its essence or essential form. Attitude is secondary. Now, essence is primary, attitude is secondary. Attitude is the subjective orientation by which essence is perceived or experienced. This can be more analogous to the idea of consciousness, awareness. It's one thing to say, or to be, I am, and then realize, like as a child does when he gets around 2 or 3, and goes like, well, me, or even a little earlier. It's one thing to be a thing and have an essence. It's another thing to be aware of oneself. That's attitude. Attitude does not have to be something where it's like going along with attitude, like we say in America, like attitude. That's not what it has to be. Fortune is tertiary, and it's the objective or manifest experience of essence over a period of time and space. This goes beyond the idea of what's in consciousness to the experience in relation to what we might say other things that have a different essential nature. So there's 3 things: essence, attitude, fortune. Is that clear so far? Okay. So this takes us to a triangulation table that I've constructed several years back. And it's a different way of looking at rulership in a broader philosophical framework that also has some specificity. I will go over some of it in detail, mainly for our purposes. So rulership is an essence that's valued at 5. You remember that the dignity table had rulership at 5. Okay? So that goes along with the idea of the time and space as eternal now. You know, who are you? Well, I'm Sam. Well, who's Sam? Well, I can say I've always been Sam, or some permutation of Sam. In the sense of eternity, or whether that's like, you know, my 47 years of life. Now, the associative experience, I will mention this briefly. This is more applicable for horary. Okay, that's where I first started thinking about these particular things. So when we're talking about a planet and rulership, it's going to be the idea of love. It's not. It emanates like a mother or a father loving a child. It just comes out of it. Exaltation is attitude that emerges from essence. So now one thing has come away from 5, which now equals 4. So exaltation, the reason why we can describe exaltation as +4 is because it has separated from rulership. It's more in the temporal now. So the idea of like, well, right now, where right now is, the idea of movement. That actually comes with a little more. It's one thing to love a child, but isn't my child the prettiest child? Isn't this pig the prettiest pig you've ever seen? It comes with a certain feeling attached with it that has a lot more attitude. Triplicity takes fortune, the third or tertiary principle we introduced, and it emerges now also from essence which now puts us at 3. Because this was at 4, and now it's at 3. This is more long-term cycles. So this is where we talk about affinity. I like you. It doesn't have to go, it hasn't graduated to love. Term is essence. Essence now separates from the combined presence of attitude and fortune. We can say that they have become their own things. So now it puts that more at 2. This is more short-term episodes. One tolerates a person or has interest. This is the same thing. If you were to see a planet more in term, it would be it's like something is interesting, it has a proclivity toward it, but it's not necessarily something that has to be essential to its being. Face is attitude and fortune. Attitude and fortune are about to dissolve back into essence, to disappear. And these are more transient moments, things that are very fleeting, things that, you know, like you better get to the store right now or you're going to miss the deal. And it's different from the temporal now, because the temporal now could be like, oh, it doesn't have to be the exact minute, right? It could be a general sense. This is where one notices or trifles away, and I'll get more into this, hopefully. It resists sacrificing. This means that one is holding on by the clutches of one's teeth or nails in terms of dealing with something by face. Attitude and fortune is the only thing you have because you've lost your essence. So let's go through each of these, and let's start with the top one, rulership. Rulership, explained, means that we have the power to just be. I compare this to putting your feet up and walking around in your PJs or nude like you're at home, right? Or in your own home. When you're at home, you feel comfortable. You can express yourself. You can naturally be whoever you see yourself as. There are no obligations, but there's a natural appreciation or expression. There's an effusiveness. Like if you love the sun, how many of you like the sun? Okay, I actually do too. If you love the sun, then you just feel the energy come out of you for the sun. You don't have to work at it. If you like the snow, I'm actually from Buffalo. You know Buffalo, New York? You've seen it buried under snow? Right. I actually don't really like the snow, right? But let's say, for the sake of argument, I did. Then when it snows, you just feel the energy. There's an appreciation. This is rulership. Where there's just an effusiveness, there's an energy that just kind of has a measure of natural camaraderie or affinity. Debility and detriment explained. And I want you to look at this image. I don't know if you can see it clearly. I guess it's after a bachelor party. And what I really loved about this image is the kid up there. I guess in the I don't know if you can see him.
In the cabinet. In the cabinet.
In the cabinet. And this is an essential idea to know about a planet that is out of rulership. So a planet out of its rulership in its detriment or debility is put out, but may not know by how much it is put out. As in, it's the last to know. It's also a misbehaving planet, like these guys, we would hope, wouldn't do that to their own home. But because they're at a hotel, this is something that they just kind of act out. A debilitated planet is determined to act at home while obviously not being there. Or to act in another place in a way it wouldn't at home, like a hotel. The planet is somehow, this is another thing that I've seen about debilitated planets or planets that are in detriment. The planet is somehow anxious about the affairs associated with itself, or it has some doubts about its ability or interest, as if these interests or abilities were borrowed or rented. Let me give you an example. Now, notice how I framed this though. I did not say this person or this expression means that the person is incompetent related to the planet. Mercury in Sagittarius is a very good example of this. So Mercury in Sagittarius, as an example, we're not talking strictly about a person, but an idea, can communicate quite effectively, let's say. But they may not be certain they're communicating effectively. They may like, did you understand what I said? Yeah. You spoke English? I speak English? we had this moment of understanding. Yeah. So this may be the thing. Or they could over-express themselves because they doubt the ability to be clear. That can be what happens with Mercury and Sagittarius as an example. So just look at some examples here. I have others. Consider these, and these are just examples to get you thinking about different ways to understand ability and detriment. A soldier attempting to negotiate a peace treaty with his gun on the table. We're going to have peace in our time. Mars and Libra. A woman leaves her new date in a restaurant to spy on her ex and his new girlfriend at a hotel a few doors down. Venus and Scorpio. A reporter submits a 30,000 words on a dirty city hall politics for a 2,500 word article that should introduce tourists to the city. Mercury and Sagittarius. I'm going to tell the truth, damn it, and everyone's going to know. But, I mean, in the wrong way. Okay? Now, let's cover this. We have to get this out. Are ours rulers? Now, I'm not going to get in a long debate about it, but I did say in my description that I would talk about a way that we might be able to make peace with the idea of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as rulers of signs. And so, modern rulers has been something that was mainly introduced in the 20th century, mainly because the last planet as we have it, Pluto, was introduced in the 20th century. But Karen Burke, an American astrologer, proposes a very unique idea from this June Wakefield on how we might look at the three outer planets as related to the rulers. Now again, to make it clear, I don't use outer planets in my consistent practice as rulers, or I don't use them consistently, or I haven't used them in maybe 15 years. However, I think this is an entertaining thing, or something that you might want to entertain. The sun in the chart is not the true sun. Instead, it's an Earth-Moon dyad. We can all agree on that. It's not, the sun doesn't literally go around the Earth, right? It's the Earth and the Moon going around the sun. So what he's saying there, and what Wakefield is saying, the true sun's energy is expressed in the material plane through all the planets and all the signs. The one thing to consider is that we might think of the outer planets as secondary suns that might be related to at least three planes of consciousness, or things related to consciousness: matter, mind, and life. And so we can say Uranus is a ruler of the plane of matter, because Uranus has an association with Saturn and the Earth-Moon dyad. So that would cover Aquarius, Capricorn, Cancer, and Leo. Pluto is a ruler of the plane of life, expresses through Mars and Venus. Now, I make an amendment here. I mean, I introduced and could use these four signs: Aries, Taurus, Libra, and Scorpio. But I might define the plane of life as also the plane of desire. Okay, in terms of Mars and Venus acting upon that way. Neptune is the ruler of the plane of mind, which is something I do maintain. Expresses itself through Jupiter and Mercury, because Jupiter and Mercury, if you haven't noticed, rule all the mutable signs, right? And so we have Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces. So rather than thinking that these outer planets rule just one other sign, we can think about them as contributing to four other signs. So that's just something to entertain. I wanted to put that in the mix, but we can move on, and I just want to refresh something. One of the reasons why I subscribe to rulerships is the perfect geometry of this. And so, we start out with the moon and the sun, and then we see Mercury flanking both the king and the queen, Venus flanking again, and then same thing with Mars, and then with Jupiter, and then Saturn opposing them. So there's a beautiful symmetry in that gives an elegance on rulership, which is not about affinity, but more so in terms of both geometry and also a sense of just relationship. All right, let's go to the exaltations. So the exaltations, we have the sun at the top and the moon together. Now, I want to make that a key point. The sun and the moon stay together. I'm not saying this is the only reason why we have the exaltation in Aries. I'm not saying this is the only reason why we have the moon's exaltation in Taurus. But this makes sense in relation to them. The exaltations and the falls of each planet. So one thing you'll see is I look at the relationships between these planets as a way of understanding why they might be exalted there or in fall, in another place. So, just to be clear, Sun in Aries, Moon in Taurus, Jupiter's in Cancer. Mercury is exalted in his own sign, traditionally. Saturn's in Libra, Mars is in Capricorn, Venus is exalted in Pisces. Exaltation explained. Attitude, you might remember, when we get to exaltation, separates from essence. Meaning attitude, consciousness comes to think of itself as its own thing, as not tied up in essence. So essence is just the natural state of being. But when you start having commentary on how you are being, then you're going toward the level of attitude. So this is what happens with exaltation. Home away from home, you're an honored guest. This is the traditional breakdown for exaltation, meaning that you're treated as someone who's revered away from home, but having like your own home away from home. Competitive expression is another way in which one can also look at exaltation. Awards and honors bestowed. Feels entitled or prized. Feels no obligation, but should. Pride instead of gratitude. Actions are performed with attachment rather than with detachment. This is the same thing that's talked about in the Gita, where you perform things as if it's of your own will rather than something that you contribute and are part of. Reconnecting to essence, free of attitude. Now that's the pathway home, and I get more into that. Here's some, I'll have an example. Fall explained. This is different. So fall is similar, but yet different. Fall is attitude separates from essence. But what is exile from home? Which is different than detriment, you might remember, where you act like you're at home, but you're not. So it's that awkward moment, and I'm sure this is something that happened when you were younger, not hopefully when we're older. When you go to a friend's house and get really comfortable and you put your feet on the furniture, and it's not, you're not supposed to do that, that's more detriment. Where you're dealing with fall, this is when you know that you're out of your place. When you've been kicked out of your home, evicted, or sent away. Robbed of one's belongings and driven away. The ache of something missing. One wallows or sometimes feels capped in the experience of the planet in fall. Now these are different things. These are the experiences that you might feel over the course of a life, might feel only occasionally, but this is the nature of what can happen when we talk about the fall. Person struggles to learn the graces of the planet in fall. That's very important, because when the planet is exalted, it might rely too much on the graces of that planet, or that particular position. But when the planet is in fall, it needs to learn that. So Saturn in Aries needs to learn more from the idea of Saturn in Libra. That's an example. Forlorn and forsaken is another experience. Must face the failing of what that planet signifies with courage and healing. So again, let's just go over what's the difference between detriment and fall before we get more into the experience of exaltation and fall. So planets and detriments are put out, but may not know by how much, as in the last to know. Conversely, planets in fall, planets feel in the fall that they have fallen from grace and know their disadvantage and remember. Just like using the idea of Lucifer, he knows he is fallen. He knows he is a fallen angel, that he is away from his home. Determined to act at home while obviously not there, determined to regain what the planet wants in a very challenging way. Anxious about affairs associated with the planet in detriment, as if those things were borrowed or rented, may feel fear or avoid taking responsibility for their own predicament. From like on the waterfront, I could have been a contender. It has this idea like, if I had gotten my chance, or if so had been stolen from me what I had was naturally entitled, I would have been the best. So they can get caught up in their past, or what could have been. So again, this is more the idea of the experience of each of these planets. Let's talk about each of them in their exaltation and fall, and then give an idea how we can have a breakthrough moment or way of understanding the planet exaltation or fall that might help our clients or help yourself. Before I do that, any questions so far? Everything's clear?
Yeah.
Excellent. Sun in Aries. Resurrection of the sun in spring. Okay, I know we're in spring, right? Whereas we're talking about fall, we can get into that another time, but based on how we look at hemispheres, this is the resurrection of the sun in the spring. Sun thrives in the place of the lesser malefic, Mars. It's important because there's a way in which I've come to see that the planets work with each other. So the sun works with the lesser malefic in a way, just like the moon works with the lesser benefic. Okay? Self is the greatest surprises. So just like the sun, the experience of the sun is the self. So it's like, well, I must be the greatest thing. This is what I have. This is the attitude when it comes to it. Lives for the battle. Feels entitled to privileges that allow them to be first and victorious. But here's the breakthrough moment. This is where the sun in Aries can learn something else in terms of consciousness. Learning that I am of Aries is much too large, much too vast to be attached to a me, first and foremost. So do you know the difference what I mean in terms of I am versus me? I am goes with, when I say, who am I, right? Who is that I am in every sentence that we say, I am Sam, I am hungry. Who is that I am? You can say it's divine, you can say it's just, a way of describing myself, but it is something beyond yourself. Me points to something that seems more concrete, but yet may not be. So that's the spiritual idea of it. Sun in Libra, fall of the year, hence the name for autumn in that sense. Light of self and most other things must be shared. The sun diffuses its energy. It gives rather than consolidates. Lives to consider and rationalize rather than just have courage or live for the battle. Feels obligated to consider self second and can resent it to avoid inevitable conflict. It doesn't want the Aries experience. It wants to avoid that. The breakthrough moment is learning that rationalizing away conflict to be considerate or compromise is way worse than using courage to reason toward a win-win solution. Win-win, where both parties can win, rather than compromise where you have to lose a little, I have to win more, or I lose a little, and you win more. The moon in Taurus is seated next to the king in Aries, or the other royal if we want to avoid sexism. Luxury, comfort, sensuality, and high quality reign supreme. Because again, we're talking about a royal. Can be too attached to the good life and heightened senses. Feels entitled to be right, comfortable, or strong rather than face vulnerability. And it's again, where do I get the sense of not wanting to deal with vulnerability? Because it's an earth sign, it wants to kind of feel rock solid. It wants to feel the vantage point of knowing that, I'm terra firma. But that may not be the experience that allows the moon in Taurus to grow. The breakthrough moment, learning that the hazard risk is not going broke or toward being broken. To know receiving is not incompetence. That you can trust the universe to give, and that you also can give without feeling like you're going to go broke or be broken. Is that clear?
Yeah.
You have to forgive me. I did have a wife as a poet. I know I've had a lot of wives. I grew up a preacher, Muslim. But sometimes I go into the poetic mode, but I don't want it to be obscure.
Yes.
Okay. Moon in Scorpio, inverse of the sun, falls in the sign of Mars. Remember, the sun is exalted in a lesser malefic, but the moon falls with the lesser malefic. Okay? This is, like I said, the sun falls in the sign of Venus. Feels obligated to probe and understand his or her own motivations and those of other people. In Scorpio, the moon feels like the comfort has to be a struggle or earned rather than appreciated. The breakthrough moment for the moon in Scorpio is the trust that life and adversity can reflect the cosmos that perspires for you as much as it appears to conspire against you. Safety stops being measured by what you can control, to feel comfortable in one's own skin. The other way I kind of envision the moon in Scorpio is picturing, you guys know who Martha Stewart is?
Yeah.
Okay, it's picturing Martha Stewart in a firehouse. And she wants to kind of take care of things and nurture, but she always has to be on the go and never knows when she may be called out and rushed out to actually help someone else or do something else. That's my vision in some sense of the moon in Scorpio. So the moon in Scorpio, one might say, is part of this breakthrough moment, is not thinking like, oh, you're insecure, you have all these issues, blah, blah, blah. It's more so realizing that the moon in Scorpio would do well in a crisis, but can't always look at crisis as something that's coming for them. It's something in which they can actually create a positive sense of crisis to help others, as an example. Doesn't mean that they're doomed to just only help others, but they can deal with crises differently. They just have to find the optimal conditions for a crisis. Mercury in Virgo. Modern exaltation is Aquarius, but we'll ignore that. That's not historically true. Because you might read that, and I know some books have that, Mercury's exalted in Aquarius. That's new. That's very new in the last 60, 70 years. Yeah. Mercury never strays from a place far from the sun, or from the sun. So Mercury is going to be near the sun. Discrete, and there's a practical reason, right? It never goes that far in actual distance from the sun. So this is one of the reasons why we also would say Mercury is going to be exalted in Virgo. Discrete parts, efficiency, and evaluation rule the day, every day, for the Mercury in Virgo. Feels entitled to champion what the mind does over feeling, sensing, intuiting, or anything else. The breakthrough moment is when the synthesis of the whole, not just the parts, is felt and works. Trusting the process rather than thinking that it has to have an attachment to a product. As versus the Mercury in Pisces, away from the luminaries and in the home of Jupiter. Feels obligated to wade through a sea of ideas or data to understand. Now, here's one way in which I describe the Mercury in Pisces. Mercury in Pisces is the frustration of not being able to show one's work in maths. It's knowing the answer, but not knowing how you came to the answer. So it's like working out the algebraic equations in your head, and then the teacher had written it out on the board, but you did it a whole different way, which might have been like something that advances the human race 500 years. You didn't know. You just did it the way it makes sense in your head, because you're like Einstein, really. But you can't demonstrate. Your teacher thinks it's all wrong because you didn't do it the way she had instructed. Breakthrough moment, when the urgency of a solution summons the patience and fortitude to endure through a process that leads to a product or achievable result. Rather than getting lost, there's more of an emotional, compelling reason why you must come up with the answer. And then something else happens for the Mercury in Pisces. You'll start to see a theme with these, which I'll come to, in terms of how we can counsel and talk about planets. And I am thinking more as a counseling astrologer. It's going to be different for horary, right? Because sometimes with horary you can just judge whether something is going to be effective or whatever, but we can go into a deeper nuance of it also in looking at these dignities. Venus in Pisces, one of her signs exalts the moon, the other fells the sun. She rises in the sign of the greater beneficence. So she establishes a different relationship to Jupiter, right? So just like Jupiter develops a different relationship to the moon, which we'll get to. Virtue, beauty, and refinement are heavenly. So these are things that one should just have. These are the things to be enjoyed. Feels entitled to devotion, adoration, unquestioned respect for what's quality and beautiful. This is, I don't know how it is here in South Africa. Do you have the equivalent of a prom? Or like what we call in America? Right. Or homecoming, right? For colleges or things like that? Yes? Okay. So this is the homecoming queen, the prom queen. Who knows, I'm just remarkable, who appreciates the remarkableness, or whether it's her beauty, her brains, all of the above. This is what can be Venus in Pisces. And she may not necessarily be vain in that sense, but thinks everything should be, quality and beautiful and nice in that sense. Breakthrough moment, to be truly open to the spirit of love in all things and situations rather than seeking heaven on earth. Idealizing ideal conditions rather than you can work through even like the most wretched conditions with an open heart. Now, I have more on Venus and Virgo because I've had more clients, for whatever reason we draw people on this. I don't have this particular one. People might think, you have Venus and Virgo? No. But I have a lot of clients who have Venus and Virgo, so I have had a lot to say about Venus and Virgo. So let me go through it with you. She falls in the home of a fellow court minister with completely different functions. And so this is the court minister right next to her, right? This is the opposite to where she's exalted Jupiter, and Mercury has an oppositional relationship to Jupiter. She feels obligated to and anxious to please rather than to be pleased. Completely different experience from Venus and Pisces. Must learn that finding a partner as a helpmate is not becoming the help. Devoted to self-improvement and wants to experience dedication to something lofty, often by using analysis and study rather than intuition or visceral attraction. I want to be a better lover. Let me read all the books I can about it. Rather than feeling through it. Practically perfect people never permit sentiment to muddle their thinking. Mary Poppins. As played by Julie Andrews, who has a Venus in Virgo. Breakthrough moment when one's love and compassion is used to raise others where they need to be, not necessarily where you are. It's like the social worker who takes the social work home and thinking that you have to kind of get people where you are. You have to get them where they need to be. Or when they feel entitled to feel inspired toward higher emotional, spiritual, and mental heights from others without feeling like they must do more. No one has anointed the Venus and Virgo to always play Mother Teresa. Mars in Capricorn. One of his signs exalts the sun, the other fells the moon, which is like the same, the contrary thing that happens with Venus. Thrives in a sign where the moon does not. Strategy, structure of things, determination, and freedom to stick to one's personal mission or work are chief. So it's like all about the mission. This is, the negative is where, Terminator, you remember Terminator? Terminator could be like the Mars in Capricorn. I will do my mission regardless. Entitled to expressing might with what's right and to be left alone to their own wild world of work and exploring the structures of the world. So that actually can be a challenge, in terms of entitlement to what's, might by right. But the other thing of being left to their wild world of work is that they have to feel immersed in something. And one of the people I think about with this is Goethe. Goethe also had a very strong Mars in Capricorn. And we know a lot about his literary work, but what many people may not realize about him is that he also used to love to tinker with chemicals, and he was like a polymath in terms of wanting to be in biology and all these different things. So this is yet someone who really kind of saturated himself with wanting to understand what's the structure of the world, what's the Saturnian experience by immersing himself firsthand into it. Breakthrough moment when winning or cracking the code for the structure of the world isn't everything. The key thing to win is the mastery of oneself, not just what you think is the external world. Mars in Cancer languishes where the moon thrives. Feels obligated to defend what's close to the heart and home. Frustrated by the impulse to push boundaries, but never too much for fear of leaving a comfort zone of the heart. Competition may encroach too much on the whole person. Because Mars is all about that energy, but the Cancer energy, the idea of the moon, makes it much more emotional and personal. Breakthrough moment when the courage to venture too far from one's safety zone is greater than the fear, making everything worth the sacrifice. The willingness to lose oneself to gain more. This is what Robert Hand is talking about with the high Mars. And one thing I will tell you, there are many do when I have longer time, but one of the interesting things is that most of the most celebrated athletes that we know will have a detrimented or fallen Mars. And this is because, in some sense, they have to make a breakthrough. There's a push that they have. And so that's why I'm going along with this idea, now explaining a little more about my theme, is that every planet just has to find the right context for itself. And given the right circumstances, your planet can become awesome. I'll give you an example. When I need to become, my friends can attest to this, although I don't think you've experienced it. When I need to be an asshole, when I need to be an asshole, my Saturn in Aries is great.
Yeah.
The discipline, though, is learning when not to have your Saturn in Aries run all over the place. When you need to be highly competitive, your Mars in Cancer can be formidable. It's finding the right circumstances by which you can channel these particular essential dignities. Jupiter in Cancer, the ambassador comes home to the moon. So I call him the ambassador because he's the one who ventures far. Security, home, comfort, and feelings reign supreme. Feels entitled to his or her own sense of safety, security, and emotional well-being. If ethical centered, now this is something that I have found more from my experience. This is one of the things where I have to throw it in. If the ethical center is compromised by selfishness and greed with this particular placement, they are more likely to receive negative attention faster. Why? Anybody might know why they might receive it faster?
Moon's public and Jupiter's blowing it up.
Right. Exactly. The moon is, the moon is public, right? And Jupiter will expand and expound on more. So with Jupiter in Cancer, if you do something foul, a politician has a Jupiter in Cancer, and they want to be shady, they're going to get found out. More likely. Popularity can work against them as notoriety. Breakthrough moment to connect to the bounty of the cosmos as yours and not only for yours. Where you can share the bounty. For instance, I can say that, without saying too much, all of this is the expression of someone with a Jupiter in Cancer. In terms of finding the bounty and realizing it's something to give to the world. Jupiter in Capricorn. Jupiter falls in the place of the moon's challenger, Saturn. Feels obligated to inherit standards that must be upheld, suffered from, or surpassed. Frustrated that ideals are restricted by the tedium of work, situations, and people who are less than ideal. They want to break through and experience the largeness of life in an ideal form, the Jupiterian, expansive form, but has to deal with the structure sometimes of confinement. One beautiful illustration of this lesson that I'm always moved by is Malcolm X. And Malcolm X had to break away from a structure, which was the Nation of Islam, and the ideal that he thought it was in order to find his own path. Now, he did die early, but I believe one of the things we can say, he died at 39, but one of the things that we can say is that the moment that he died, 39, 38, he did start to find his own path. He became his master, rather than someone who was beholden to another structure or another master. The other thing that's interesting about Malcolm X, as an illustration, is that we know him as this black nationalist and how he worked with the Nation of Islam. But in terms of inheriting the structure, what I say in terms of inherited standards, he was the second generation of his time, meaning that his father was a nationalist before him, and also active. In fact, that may have been how his father contributed to his death. So Jupiter in Capricorn deals with the standard. Another thing that's kind of a funny thing for me with Jupiter in Capricorn is that Karl Marx also has this Jupiter, and we even have, like, what's it called in terms of the communist song? The standard? I'm blanking on the name. I just had it a second ago. But in terms, not the Communist Manifesto, but the song, in terms of holding the flag and the standard, this is also. And I'm not just talking about what has come resources, how it dealt with restriction. So the breakthrough moment is to reconnect to the fluidity and creativity of the cosmos in order to recognize that ideals are guides, not exacting instructions to replicate. The path of the disciple becoming his or her own master. Saturn in Libra. Saturn thrives where the sun does not. Also, the frontiersman thrives in the place of the lesser benefic, Venus. So there's almost like a trade. You know, one of the things now I know this is going to sound funny. I used to be also an actor. So I learned some of this conception of this from doing King Lear twice. And one thing that's interesting about doing the classical plays is you start to think more in terms of dynamics. Things that, and I'll say it, as a Yang, we're really out of touch with, right? We don't understand royalty. It was always kind of like during rehearsal to watch American actors, like, okay, the king's coming through. The king! You know, we don't get the idea of it. So if you start thinking about these planets in courtship rulerships or connections, it becomes clear. So Saturn, almost as the guerrilla fighter, loves to be in a place where the sun has diminished power. He can shine. Whereas Sun also feels diminished in the place of a certain, where Saturn is. And conversely, because there's a way in which both planets work with the malefics, the lesser malefics, or lesser malefic and the lesser benefic, there are ways in which both of them work with them that they kind of make trade-offs. So the Sun says, when I'm in Mars' house, I will do some measure of thriving. And Saturn says, okay, when I'm in Venus' house, I will do some measure of thriving. And so there's a trade-off that happens with them. So that's just a way of thinking about exaltation rather than being just thinking about like, well, in this place it's like this, and this other place is like that. Beauty, control, sophistication, justice, and protocol are most critical and most important for the Saturn in Libra. Feels entitled to his or her own sense of an unerring judgment, rationality, and sense of beauty. Absolutely, I'm correct. Breakthrough moment, when breaking with protocol and convention, passion leads to a higher truth and love. When they can get back not just the idea of Venusian ideals, but also Martian. Like I said, there's a trade-off that has to happen. Saturn in Aries, there's a fall. The old man in the place where the sun feels alive again. Feels anxious about beginning anew while weighed down by the past or fears of losing one's independence, losing that Martian sense of self. May sometimes hide behind titular power, arrogance, or bluster more than honor and courage in action, which is what Mars, in its highest form, should be like. Breakthrough moment, when constructing one's sense of honor and law, like Libra, becomes the measure of how one achieves true authority and real independence, rather than thinking that it's through one's titular power or what has been bestowed onto you by others. You create a real connection. So a brilliant example of this that's in the news, I think it might be in the news here, is Bill Cosby, who has Saturn in Aries. Okay, we get to it. So triplicity. How am I doing on time? It looks good here, but I don't know how it looks empirically. 3:30? And I have until 4, correct?
No,
Or 3:45?
Yeah, 15.
Okay, 15 minutes. Okay. All right, giving.
25 plus.
Okay. Triplicity. Fortune emerges from essence, you might remember, now going way back. And triplicity becomes like lessons more so in terms of how we deal with the material world, the objective sense of it. And that comes to us more by set in terms of day and night. That's the triplicity that you see outlined in the blue there. There are 3 triplicity lords related to each of the elements. And there's a participating one, which is what you asked about. So there's a day ruler, there's a night one, and there's one that you can call on as a tertiary contributing factor. So in fire, it's Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. In earth, it's Venus, Moon, and Mars. Again, this is going with Dorothean. Air is Saturn, Mercury, and Jupiter. Water is Venus, Mars, and Moon. Triplicity deals more with the physical realm, the material realm, and the long-term fortunes of an area of life. So one example of this I'm going to use was Donald Trump running for president. So you can start off, let's start off with trying to figure out, is he day or night?
Day.
Was he born during the day or night?
Day.
So who's going to be his first primary triplicity ruler? I'm sorry, I didn't give you the element. If I wanted to look at his fortunes, his actual fortunes, in his second house, which is cusped by, this is whole sign, is cusped by, I know this is kind of deceptive, because he's at the very end of Leo, right? So it's not cusped by, actually, the second house. His ascendant is Leo rising, but his second house is cusped by Virgo, which is a what kind of sign in terms of element? Earth. So in terms of triplicity, how can we explain his primary triplicity ruler in the date chart? Venus. Venus is going to be one. Who's next? You got that? You got it? Okay. Let's go. So in terms of his wealth, this is one way in which triplicity has been used. We would start off with Venus to figure out the first 30 years of his life, the first third. Then we would look for the second third of his life as the secondary, the ninth ruler. Then we would look at the participating ruler for the last third, which is like until the 90 years. Then I would imagine we could repeat if you go past 90 years. Now, with Venus, what can we say about his Venus in Cancer? Is it? It has dignity by triplicity, and you can also look here, over here, Venus. I mean, you could use +5, right? But she has triplicity, rulership, and water. She's turned. Is she reasonably in a favorable position? Other than, we won't talk about accidental dignity, but her essential dignity, is it okay?
Yeah.
Yes. She does have a connection to Saturn, and she is in the 12th house. So what do you think that might signify about his first 30 years related to his fortunes?
Restriction.
Some measure of restriction. What else?
Hidden. They work very hard.
Work very hard. Anything else?
And it's hidden away in some way.
Do you think he started off with money or didn't have much?
No, I don't know. I think he is.
Well, I mean, it's his father's really wealthy. He follows his father into the same field.
Right, which is a Cancerian field, right? In terms of having investments and also real estate.
Yeah, and it's very like New York City.
Right.
It's he's, you know, I mean, later on Atlantic City and all that stuff, but he's a very like Cancer, New York City kind of.
So he ventures more in terms of dealing with home. The next ruler, interestingly enough, for the next 30 years is the Moon in Sagittarius. Notice where it is. Where is it? What do you think his triplicity for that particular time is going to be dealing with? Amusement.
Robert asking with Venus sitting just there in a different house, so Venus would be in the first house.
Yeah.
That's what Robert was saying this morning, that we should look at planets that are just
As a boundary line? Okay. I mean, I wasn't even focusing so much on the 12th house experience.
yeah.
I was just focusing more on his natural experience. But yeah, I mean, I actually do keep it somewhat up there, right? But yeah.
But he's he doesn't become a big deal until he's in his 40s.
Right, and this is more the time frame.
Yeah.
And his moon in Sagittarius is more expansive. The idea of where it is in the 5th house, which is about rolling and, you know, wheeling and dealing, making money. It's not so much about real estate anymore, or even home. This is venturing out where Trump becomes the brand. The name becomes the brand, which is interesting. Is Jupiter here in the 3rd house. It largely starts connecting more to what he communicates. This is also the time frame where he's writing, he's communicating. All these particular things start to manifest in the dynamic here.
It's going to be huge.
Right. Now, let's look here. What's happening happening here as he's in his, going into his next or last, we won't say which, but his next triplicity time, next 30 years. What's here?
Not that much, so term and face rulership only.
No, what's his participating ruler?
Sun.
Mars.
Mars.
Yeah.
Mars. Where's Mars?
First house.
It's all about him. He makes his fortune literally with him as the brand. He went from translating, and this is very powerful because there's a trine here. He actually did something. I actually, obviously, I'm not necessarily rooting, I'm not rooting for Trump at all for our presidency, but I do think something is very impressive about what this man has done. What he's done is that, and this translates somewhat to politics, he's taken his whole emphasis on creating pleasure and fun and entertainment into something that is now tied up to his own personality. And this is what's pushing him to be in a certain sphere, even for the presidency. It's dangerous, don't get me wrong, but this is where his next level of fortune is coming from. His own sense of identity by himself.
His catchphrase, you're fired.
Right, it was his Mars.
Yeah.
It's a shame he doesn't get his hand in.
Yes.
Ask you something, and I think totally ignorant here, but I see you did the triplicity of just the sign of the second house, not the ruler.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just the sign. Is that how you do it?
Yeah.
Okay, because I've obviously doing it wrong.
No, you're doing it wrong. You can do it differently. You can do it with Mercury.
Yeah,
You can do Mercury as another testimony.
yeah, okay. Well,
And it comes-
there's a similar.
Right.
Okay.
Can I just ask you something? Not that you probably want to extend your interpretation that far, but having said what you just said around his Mars sitting in Leo there, how would you interpret Neptune sitting there?
Interpret what?
How would you, in terms of this third, is that Pluto or what's sitting in the first house?
Pluto in the first.
It
Yeah,
looks
it's in the
Neptune
first.
to me.
He wants power.
Power.
He wants the power.
Yeah, but Neptune's sitting there.
No, that's Pluto.
That's Pluto.
He wants power. He feels he's entitled. He feels he's entitled to the presidency. Terms or bounds. I think I have maybe about now 10 minutes. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Terms or bounds. So we're almost finished. Essence separates from the combined presence of attitude and fortune, meaning we only have attitude and fortune left. Essence is left the building. So planet is like a projectile that's flying by inertia rather than its own power. One is forced along by a tide of circumstances, meaning that it kind of is running on its own momentum, or as we say in the States, it's running on fumes. When we're talking about a car that's going on gas, on petrol. Reveals what we are compelled to treasure as our lot and fortune. And one of my favorite examples for this, even though it's kind of a dual thing, is Martin Luther King Jr. And Martin Luther King Jr. actually only has his Mercury in dignity, for all that surprise, by term, and he also, to be fair, has it by face. But other than that, he doesn't have it any other essential dignity because he's born during the day. So his triplicity ruler for that Mercury is still Saturn, right? So, but what's interesting is that he has an angular Saturn, an angular Mercury. So Mercury is going to be predominant in his life, which is true. We know his speeches, I have a dream today, that whole thing. But one of the things that's compelling about King didn't want to be king. When I say didn't want to be king, I don't mean he wanted to be the Lord and ruler. He didn't want to be like this majestic head of talking about civil rights and disobedience. It was not what he set off to be. And in fact, his Mercury got him in trouble quite a few times. And I have to say this, and I'm being critical of one of the most celebrated leaders of our time. He's kind of a lazy writer and lazy, not want to say lazy thinker, certainly, but he wasn't someone who wanted to work hard with his Mercury. This is why I think he also got in trouble in terms of writing with his dissertation. You might recall, some of you have read, there were calls of plagiarism. And I think what many people do when they're doing their dissertations, forget the site or, just want to finish the damn thing. He didn't really enjoy writing books. He could do the speeches, and his first priority was for the Mercury in the 10th house, was to speak. But in terms of doing the work with that Mercury and feeling compelled to be like this speaker and this writer on these issues, that's not what he chose for himself. It almost was the idea of fate. So I thought when I looked at this chart closely and saw that, because I expected like this Mercury to be very strong and powerful, it's only strong by accidental dignity. It's not necessarily strong by essential dignity.
Yeah.
By face, and then we can start to close out, attitude and fortune dissolve back into essence. Meaning that, attitude and fortune are just hanging on, about to go down, almost like a toilet, back into essence. Last moments of motion before something stops. Ephemeral. It's like spreading one's butter over too much bread. To quote Tolkien. What we resist sacrificing that doesn't satisfy our growth and development. This is where I'm going to kind of leave you with two charts that I look at with a very morbid, strange sense of humor. So indulge me as we look at the charts of Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. Donald Rumsfeld, July 9th, 1932, 5:40 p.m., Chicago, Illinois, even though I haven't done this for just have it fixed in my mind for a second. If you look at his, now, does anyone know who he was or remember?
No.
Donald Rumsfeld was U.S. Department of State, he was the Defense Secretary of the U.S. Department of Defense. And what's interesting is that you would expect someone who's in charge of perhaps the strongest military in human history to actually have a strong Mars. Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
All right. He does have an angular Mars, which gives it accidental dignity. But his Mars only has strength by face. It's just barely hanging on for dear life. So why I think that's funny, it shows that he didn't have a high level of confidence for the job in terms of dealing with the issues of Mars. He naturally, and he did struggle with it. I mean, this is a man who actually sent troops to a country without the equipment, some basic equipment, to even be there. Huh? Exactly. And here he has an incredibly weakened Mars. Only able to hold on, which means he was only competent to get the job, but not necessarily stay and maintain and do work with the job. And here's the thing, if I'm not remembering correctly, correct me, he had it twice.
Okay.
He had what twice?
He was Department of Defense Secretary twice.
Yes, I think so.
Well, yeah, he served, I think, for Ford.
Mm-hmm.
But in his house of career is a square to Neptune.
Right.
Illusion, the magician.
Or Bush.
Yeah.
T square.
Yep. But Mars is barely hanging on. If that weren't enough for you, Dick Cheney, who was also a Secretary of Defense head, here's his Mars. His Mars is also angular, directly opposite to Rumsfeld, right? And also enjoying a T-square to, at least a square to his moon, and a Y-square to Neptune. But again, only has some measure of dignity, even that by mutual reception between the moon and the moon being in Mars's term. So they only have a mutual reception by term. Meaning that Mars is in the term, face of Venus, moon, and then the moon is in the face of Mars. So, yeah, it's only a mutual reception, which is even weaker.
So, do we know where Donald Rumsfeld actually did any active service?
He did limited service in the Navy.
So I'm just thinking Mars in Gemini, you get more of a war of words then, so he's all about verbal and...
Right.
Rather
Yeah,
than
he did very limited service, he never saw combat, and he worked more in pharmaceutical. He worked more in terms of pharmaceutical industry than he actually served in terms of actually being in the military. He did more, he had done a lot of work in government, to give him credit, right? But, so he worked, you know, with Nixon, he also worked, he was in Congress, he was a representative in the US Congress, but he actually, Ford, yeah, sorry. But he actually didn't do much of a stint in the military.
Would that weak Mars and drum cells make him very, very easily manipulated by the Bushes?
Yes, right, and caught up with it. So again, to know about, and this is finding the right job. So should he have been the head of defense? No.
No.
But could he have been someone on the front line dealing with some measure of Mars themes, or you know, dealing with protocols, or
selling weapons
or,
to Iraq.
or selling weapons? Yes. But he should not be the person in charge of that. And this is what I'm saying in terms of finding the right job,
Context.
right context for an essential dignity.
He's kind of on the verbal front line though with Mars and Gemini.
Right, he was so.
What I know about him was during the Iraq War, he was just always on the TV.
Right, correct.
Golly gee, golly gosh.
And again, right. But what testifies, and this is a different lecture, but one thing that I do pay attention to is essential dignity versus accidental dignity. So accidental dignity means that you get the prime seat for either your incompetence or your competence.
Yeah.
So he actually, both of them could get prime seats for their incompetence related to Martian particular themes, which is in this particular case being the head of the Department of Defense of one of the strongest militaries in history, which is scary.
And this is America.
Hmm?
This is America.
Right.
We don't too bad your adults either.
So concluding thoughts, rather than rote and flat descriptions of planets, the 5 essential dignities and their respective contrary counterparts can be used to evaluate components of time, space, quality, which is essence, physicality, and intentionality, attitude, related to a person, place, or thing. In other words, to give dimension. The astrologer's gift is to generate ideas for what context would ripen the original or optimal conditions of planets, like how Mars, in detrimented or fallen conditions, thrives in competition or with a loftier sense of mission. So, thank you. Here's my contact.